Thank you everybody for coming. We are very privileged tonight to have a guest from New York, Mark Maltz. He's a consultant to startups and large corporations alike. And Mark and I worked together more than a decade ago on organizational resilience projects in New York. We did a study of the firms that were hit by the 2001 September 11th attacks, and particularly focused on the story of one company that did remarkably well. They were decimated, and yet they came back from this almost unimaginable catastrophe, and within 1 year were performing better than ever. Just regrowth of a business, billion-dollar business really. And Mark has replicated. Mark not only was the co-author of those papers, but he was intimately involved in the success of that company, acting as the advisor to the CEO who managed that resurrection. Mark's also worked with a lot of other companies in the interim, including one we'll cover in the class tonight, taking firms from what could otherwise be a crisis and seizing opportunity from that. Tonight, though, he'll be talking about trauma in the organization, managing disruption, and Mark is really a unique combination of sort of business wherewithal, organizational insight, and psychological acumen. So it's a very unique perspective. He's worked at the William Allison White Institute for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy in New York. And so he'll be talking on one of the specialties there about the stimulation. So thank you, Mark, for coming.
You're welcome. So some of you are from a class on creativity, right? So we're gonna, I'm gonna try to not traumatize you by talking about trauma. What I've learned about over the last, I don't know, however long I've been doing this, which is since the early 1990s. And before that, I was in corporate America, so I was sort of trying to do this on the other side, being an executive in a corporation. A large corporation at the time, something called AT&T. That I always found that disruption was always experienced as something really quite traumatic internally. Whether it was trauma related to a shift in the markets, trauma related to something that happened with a product or a service, trauma related to interpersonal difficulties within the organization, between teams, between departments. These things, and I want to make sure you understand that I don't use the word trauma lightly. I am actually equating or saying that when someone is seriously traumatized by a horrible event, such as 9/11, or some horrible personal event, it actually has the exact same chemical, physiological, and biological impact on us as if it were just a product or service or market or job-related or interpersonal or team conflict. That unfortunately our brains don't process these events differently. So I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit of what we know about the latest in neurobiology and how our brain functions. And I'd like to use that as a metaphor to think about organizational cases. So that's what we're going to do. Does that sound okay? So in most organizations, that is the thinker, actually. I took that recently in Paris. That's not the thinker that's here in Philadelphia. So we often think or read a lot about how if we can only think better and have better data, have better metadata, have better data analytics, and all these other kinds of thought processes, we could really find our way through almost anything. And I actually think that this is really not the case. And that I think, and in my experience, and in the experience of many, many, many organizations I've worked with, that there is something to this notion of organizational trauma. And just as a sidebar, since 9/11, I've been part of a study group at the White Institute in Manhattan of practitioners who deal with individual trauma and some organizational trauma, but mostly individual trauma on an ongoing basis. Psychiatrists, psychologists who really are steeped in what goes on in dealing with very severe childhood and other kinds of trauma. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about the organizational aspects of this. So, what is trauma? Let's move this along. So trauma is literally any event. Could be a single event once, could be a single event that repeats, could be multiple events that overwhelm a person's ability to basically respond, to cope or integrate the experienced thoughts, to cope or integrate the experienced emotions. It's important to keep in mind that it's both thinking and sort of the somatic and all sorts of other kinds of emotional responses, hormonal responses. There's a whole host of things that go on in trauma. And I really believe that there's a way in which our brain processing that we know today about trauma is directly related to why so many organizations get into trouble, if you will. So let's talk about the brain's response. So what does the brain do when experiencing trauma? There's basically two paths that we experience any sort of event in the world, particularly in this case trauma. There's the high road, which is we use our cerebral cortex, with the neocortex, and we really think about it, process it, add history to it, play with it, really work it through. And then there is what we commonly call the reptilian response, or the limbic methodology. Now, let me just switch programs for a moment, and we'll show you what that actually looks like. So this is our brain, right? And that's mostly the cerebral cortex that we are looking at. That's where all of our higher functioning occurs. And if we sort of bring that around, we see that there's a lot of things going on inside. And there's something called the limbic system, which is really the green and the gray and the blue. Better way of looking at it is right there, which is known as the primitive brain, or the reptilian brain. So those are our two basic processing methodologies in any sort of traumatic experience. But the interesting thing about this, the reason why we call it the reason why we call it the high and the low road is because in the high road, we go from the emotional stimulus through our thalamus into a whole set of sensory processing. So there's a whole technical process that occurs both chemically, biologically, neurologically, that we go through to really, literally think about and experience this stimulus. When we use the low road, we go immediately from the thalamus to the amygdala, and we respond. So what happens when we activate this, what might be called an expedient methodology to deal with trauma, is that we move into immediately our fight, flight, freeze, and fear response to that trauma. We don't process it. We, within milliseconds, are reacting to it. And that is interesting, because there's a difference between processing an event and reacting to an event. Right? Everybody following so far? Make sense? So when we process an event, right, we have so much more data in our brains that we can actually work with. We have all of the past history that we could conjure up around this. We have rational thinking. We have associative thinking. we can associate to this event and say, you know what, this is a lot like X or Y. And I can actually start moving myself away from the experience of the trauma and moving much closer to something to do about it, some way of dealing with it and working through it. If I'm stuck in the limbic system, no such chance. I'm purely reacting to it. I'm purely and simply just having, literally, knee-jerk reactions to whatever it is. I'm either fleeing, I'm afraid, or what we are really thinking a lot about in trauma therapy these days is we get frozen. In all of the examination, and actually a lot of work has been done by Seligman here on PTSD, what we've really learned about PTSD is that the reason why the patient or the individual is re-traumatized is because of two things. One, because I'm stuck or frozen in that limbic response. And that limbic response, no matter how long ago it was, it could be a childhood process, comes through distorted memory. Because we're learning that memory is not factual. Memory is contextual. So memory shifts over time. And thus, whatever memories are conjured up by that traumatic event are revisited in that moment. They may not be accurate, but they're sure there to heighten that sensory reactive experience in the limbic system. Follow me so far? So I guess we could say, what does this have to do with organizations? Right? Why does this have anything to do with organization? Can anybody give me an idea as to why this has something to do with organization? Anyway.
That would be reaction.
Right.
Crisis situations.
Right. That's true. Why else?
Well, if leadership is responding at the limbic level, it was going to totally bias whatever rational process might prevail.
That's right. That's right. And to bring it even to a more basic level is because organizations are not people. People are organizations. Right? Organizations are managed by us. And I think that's exactly right. We mostly respond in crisis through our limbic reaction. We don't step back, we're not thoughtful, we don't do incident reviews, we don't really think about or process in any sort of functional way what has happened. So I got a call last week, literally last week, from the head of psychiatry of a hospital in New England, a teaching college hospital in New England, who had a very serious organizational issue and needed help. Now, I wasn't available, but I put a colleague of mine from Boston, New Hampshire, in touch. And then he and I sort of put together a proposal. He's going to go sort of deal with this. But very briefly, about a year ago, the president of the nursing college within this school was accused of stealing money, embezzlement. And before the case ever went to court or anywhere else, he committed suicide. Immediately following that, or not immediately, a few months later, the nursing school was up for their periodic assessment around, their, what do you call it, their certification, accreditation, thank you. And of course, they failed the accreditation. So here we are, almost a year later, after that failure, and by the way, they appealed, and they got back their accreditation, but a year later, faculty is still in crisis, doesn't know how to proceed, the school is frozen, and they want help, right? They want somebody to come and help them through this. What help means, I'm not quite sure I understand yet. But clearly this organization is stuck in that place of dealing with the suicide and the embezzlement and the loss of accreditation and what that means to faculty and then the regaining of accreditation and Are we whole yet? I mean, they're paralyzed. It's a major university, nursing school. So I think this stuff happens all the time in organizations. So I'm going to share a couple of cases, and then we're going to get into some discussion. All right, so I'm going to sort of give it over to you guys. But let me share with you 3 or 4 cases of how I see this in actual work, and talk a little bit about what happened. So the first is what I call the protective CEO. So this CEO actually, right across over in Princeton, was brought in by a board in this company that was number 2 in their marketplace for a certain kind of software and hardware. Let me just leave it at that because I don't want to really identify the firm. So I'm brought in by the board to work with this CEO who's been in his job for 1.5 years. This CEO joined 1.5 years early to replace the former CEO, and he discovered theft, fiscal improprieties, all sorts of wonderful stuff that basically caused a huge cash drain on the organization. And he, I think, smartfully froze everything. He said, no spending greater than $1,000 without my approval. No travel without my approval. Now, this company had major facilities in Europe. So it basically meant nobody could go to the other half of the organization. They were in 3 places. They were in Princeton, they were in Cambridge, and they were in Europe, in a couple of places. Right? So basically you couldn't go anywhere without the approval of the CEO. And there were about 300 people in this company. And he also decided that he needed to rebuild trust in the executive team, and actually he needed to fire a couple of people, which he did, of the leaders, and then rebuild trust, and then create a fully functional new executive team. Problem was that this was 1.5 years after the event that he's finally, because of board pressure, contacting advisors to come in and help him. And so we're sitting in his very first ever retreat of his top 20 managers in the company. It's the first time he's ever brought these folks together. And we're sitting over in a facility over in Princeton, outside of Princeton. And my partner and I decided to put them through an exercise to really talk about how they were or weren't connected to each other. 21 people in the room. A couple of people go, we put them through this process of talking about, well, I won't get into the details of facilitation, but they had to talk about certain emotional experiences within the company. We get to the CEO, and the CEO looks around the table and he says, sadly, I don't know any of you. I don't know who you're married to. I don't know anything about your families. I just don't know you. And he got very teary. And then he tells this story, that the company he had just come from, the company that he had successfully sold, was this relatively well-known technology company that created a certain kind of security mechanism that, actually, they were the ones who created the technology behind reading the iris as a security measure. But the company had lost market share. I can't remember the reason, but they actually had to sell the technology in order to move on. Or that's what he decided as CEO. He comes home one night after successfully selling the company and saving all of the shareholders, including employees in the company, major money. So people actually got something for this company. So he thought he has this major win. He gets home, he buys a bottle of champagne, he goes to his wife and his daughter. It was successful. This is so exciting. Let's drink champagne. His daughter turns to him and she says, what did you do? He said, I sold the company. Isn't this great? She starts screaming at him, how could you? Runs out of the room and doesn't talk to him for a week. And he's sitting there scratching his head. And he's saying, what in the world? What just happened? And as he later learned, he had completely forgotten that the year before, she had brought her entire high school class on a class trip to this company to go look at all this amazing technology that her dad was managing. And part of her identification in high school, which she still was in, was caught up in who her father was and what this company did. And he just pulled the rug out without ever telling her. He never discussed what was going on at work at home. So his wife and his daughter had no idea. Completely, I mean, in other terms, we call this a little bit schizoid, right? This is a completely unrelated individual. I mean, he didn't know how to relate to his own family, didn't know how to relate to his own management team. But that, to me, was an incredibly telling moment in the consultation and to this team. We finished that work, and I'm sorry to say that a month and a half later, he was fired. Because it was way too little, too late. Because what happened is he basically froze the organization. Those are frozen trees, by the way. He literally froze the organization in his literal limbic response to what was going on. This was, of course, made worse by the fact that he didn't know how to relate to people, right? And that, in and of itself, destroyed any authority in the management structure. It absolutely destroyed all work, because everything got stalemated. People couldn't travel to each other's offices. How do you get work done? And eliminated trust, not built trust, and also disrupted the executive team. So to me, this is an extreme example of how the CEO's limbic response basically destroyed the company for a short period of time. Now, thankfully, this company still exists today. They're still number 2 in their marketplace. The CEO actually was highly competent who took over, somebody from inside the organization. And there's good news to this story. I mean, he realized immediately what was going on and what happened, reversed all these policies, started building trust within the leadership group, had to change out a few folks and things like that. Any questions before I sort of move on to the next case?
Do you ever get to the diagnostic level where you say, well, why did you have only a limbic response which isolated you?
Yeah, we
The
did.
psychoanalytic type of...
We did in our coaching, yes.
You did?
Yes, individually with him. Yeah, and this basically goes back to his childhood.
And you were actually able to surface
Oh, yeah.
childhood issues?
Oh, yeah.
We need to talk more.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a different organization that I think you all know. That's Apple in Steve's days. Does anybody in here think that his death was traumatic to Apple? Why so?
He's such a prominent figure in the organization.
Yeah,
He's not dead.
he was Apple in many ways. Other reasons?
The company had gone through a seesaw and was down, and he came back and raised them back up.
Reborn, right? Under it.
Well, I would imagine that all kinds of dynamics, psychodynamics, were triggered by this strongly authoritative figure. And suddenly, the absence of that figure must have dredged up a whole lot of stuff
Oh, yeah.
for many, many, many people who were there.
Yep. Does anybody know the share price of Apple at the moment of his death and today? How much? Right. It's about 60, it's ranged from 25, I think 16 to 25% at its worst. It's come back a little bit. Anticipation of the iPad is sort of the new iPad announcement. Is that today? That's tomorrow. Thursday is sort of lifting it a little bit. But it has really had a major, major impact on people's trust of the product set. People have been disappointed in all the product announcements so far. People have been disappointed in iOS 7. People have just been basically disappointed. And there's a way in which, internally, and some of the colleagues I've spoken with, that this is exactly, what you point out is exactly what's going on, which is that there's sort of a loss of faith that anybody really knows where this is headed, where everybody always depended on Steve to drive it forward. There was no doubt where the company was headed when he was there, right? Well, there was some doubt early on, right? There was a lot of fluctuation.
He left.
Right, well, he was fired by Scully, right. And then he came back. And he brought all that wonderful next technology, and then that became iOS, and the rest is history. So, to me, there's a great example here of trying to be thoughtful, and I think Apple is stuck somewhere between having a higher road processing of Steve's death and what to do about it, and the lower road knee-jerk response. I think Tim Cook and company, and Ives and all of them, are working very hard to try to literally stay in the higher processing of this traumatic event. But I think market forces have been really, really difficult for them. And I think that the market forces, and jury's out. Now, I'm an avid Apple fan, as you can see, but have been for many, many years. But I still think the jury's out on where this will go. Can they kick it back into gear and take off again? They have all of the makings of a truly resilient organization, for those of you who took last semester. But not quite sure yet, because I think there are some things that they do that are very knee-jerk, that are very limbic in their response, and there are things that they do who are very thoughtful. The recent announcement yesterday or the day before, whenever that was, about Burberry's former CEO coming over to head up retail. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. That's absolutely a crowning sort of high road way of responding. Let's talk about another organization that wasn't as successful. Does anybody remember Arthur Andersen? You all remember Arthur? Anybody? So Arthur Andersen, well, we'll get to who Arthur Andersen was. Well, I'll tell you now. Arthur Andersen was the world's largest private public accounting firm. Actually, it was a partnership. They were huge. And in fact, Arthur Andersen himself, who founded the firm in 1913, helped define most of the GAAP rules, the general accounting principles that we live with today. So this is an organization steeped in history and really at the top of its game. 2002, no, in 2000, we'll get to the timeline in a moment, there are two accounting scandals. One at Sunbeam and one at Waste Management. These are headlined all over the place. Because of these two, what we might call knee-jerk reactions internally in the partnership, forced a complete restructuring of how decisions were made internally. So they basically decided that any major change in the organization or any major policy required a 75% vote of the partnership. And you're talking a couple of thousand partners around the world. Think about herding a couple of thousand accountants around the world. In addition, the scandal in these two organizations immediately impacted the business of the famous Arthur Andersen consulting business. And it is these two scandals that actually stimulated Arthur Andersen Consulting's partners to say, we've had enough, we're leaving. So, one scandal, limbic response, another problem, but we're not done yet. So then, we have Enron. And Enron is what brought down Arthur Andersen. So let's look at Arthur Andersen for a moment. So, founded in 1913, in 2000, two accounting scandals, Waste Management, Sunbeam, and these are like major, these are cook in the books kind of things. So Arthur Andersen, world's largest private accounting firm, cooks the books for these two companies, right? They figure it out. 2002, Anderson Consultant splits. Partners say, we've had it, we're gone, we don't care. They become Accenture, which still exists today. 2002, 28,000 US employees, 85,000 worldwide employees, doing business in 200 countries. Think about that. That's huge, right? 2002, June 15th, they are convicted of obstruction of justice. Actually, these two people only are convicted of obstruction of justice in the Enron case. An attorney by the name of Nancy Temple and a partner from Houston by the name of David Duncan. Two people only are convicted. Right? Not sure yet what the impact is on Anderson. By the beginning of 2003, so this is less than 6 months later, the partnership is disbanded, the company does no longer exist. Imagine, world's largest, over 100,000 people in 200 countries, and in less than 6 months, because the conviction of two people and the headlines that followed, the company's gone. A little bit of a limbic response, would you say? Because it's the partners who decided to disband. Right? Partners started to jump ship and go to the competition. They just simply moved their practices to the competition, left the partnership and whatever money they had invested behind. Gone. Though the interesting thing is, May 31st, 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court found them not guilty in appeal. It didn't matter, the company was gone. But 2 years later, not even, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously overturns the conviction. So to me, it's a beautiful, beautiful series of what we might call irrational responses to crisis without higher level processing. Begins with Sunbeam and waste management. The Sunbeam stuff was all Al Duncan. If anybody has ever read about Al Duncan, any Wharton folks in the room, you all should know about Al Duncan. He was, what was he known as? Something. He used to buy companies, take every asset worth anything out of them, and then go bye-bye. In this case, he cooked the books with Anderson and was convicted for it in Florida. Waste management was also a Florida case. But the sort of the limbic response to that trauma of those two issues disabled the partnership. Because that's when they put into place this idea that the only way that Bertolino, who was their president and CEO, could have any power is if 75% of us said so. So of the 2,000 partners worldwide, if he wanted to make any change, if he wanted to invest legal, to go fight, if he wanted to do anything, he needed 75% of approximately 2,000 partners worldwide to go do it. He had no power. They dethroned their head of the organization. I mean, disempowered their head of the organization. On top of which, they started putting in all of these rules around waste management and Sunbeam that really prevented communications from all of the various different offices, the 200 or so countries that they're dealing with. Prevented their ability to actually communicate back to the main headquarters in Chicago about what was going on. So they also cut off their ability to speak to each other. Right? They put in so many different protocols and so many different processes to sort of make sure everybody was doing the right thing that they eliminated smart, logical ways of talking to one another. And in the end, the company goes away. So in your mind, what happened? What do you think? Anyway.
Well, from the first mismanagement, with sudden being waste management, they were always, all the other things after that, they were still reacting from that initial issue from their limbic system.
That's right.
Yeah.
They were what we call frozen.
Yeah.
They were frozen in that initial response. That's exactly right. They were frozen in that initial response and couldn't get out of it. It's no different than the child who's abused in childhood, who still as an adult has nightmares and reactions. It's no different than the woman or man who is yelled at constantly by their father, who reacts in a traumatized way to somebody yelling. It is no different than any of these things. It's exactly the same in my mind. Because the people responsible for the partnership at Anderson had a less than thoughtful response. And then you add, the Anderson thing was a knee-jerk, and the response to Enron was, it was just awful. So let's move on to one other case. So Steve mentioned earlier, 9:29 a.m. on September 11th, 2001. This is the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Sandler O'Neill was on the 104th floor of that South Tower. 17 people made it out alive. They made it out alive because they left within 51 seconds of when the North Tower was struck. Now, this is an interesting case because I'm still in touch with many of those 17. It was their limbic response to the North Tower's whatever was going on there, because nobody knew it was struck by planes yet, but it was their limbic fear-flight response that got them into that elevator within 51 seconds and saved their life. That's important, right? That's really important to understand that our limbic system is very useful many times. In the end, 68 people, actually 71 people lost their lives, 68 employees. These are the 68 employees. I had never known any of them before this advisory, before this consultation, and I feel like I know every single one of them quite intimately. I know their lives, I know their families, I know their loved ones, I know their history, I know a lot about them. And this is many years later. What was interesting about Sandler that really differed from all of the other investment banks, let's just stay with investment banks for a moment, in the World Trade Centers, was that they were the only one who on September 12th hired somebody to help them think about it. We were the only consulting firm hired by anyone in both of those complexes, in that entire complex, right? That we are aware of today. And we met with them on the evening of September 12th, began working with them, and we continued working in full consultation until 2005. And since 2005, we've been informal advisors and dear, dear friends. And I still talk to many of those folks on occasion. And they still call us for advice. So what happened that made Sandler different? Steve said earlier, they were profitable within a month. And they were back to soaring revenues within a couple. Today, they are twice the size they were on 9/11. And they are number one in all their markets. An interesting side fact, through 2008, 2009, and 2010, the financial crisis, they did amazingly well. Not only did they do amazingly well, but Jimmy Dunn became the confidant of Mary Shapiro, the SEC, and he's the one who was advising behind the scenes, as in a kitchen cabinet, what to do about all these failing banks. Sandler O'Neill happens to be in the middle market of banking and insurance. So not only did they go from you know, sort of muddling around in this business to number one, but they became number one and a sought-after advisor even to government. Amazing. What we found was a lot of interesting stuff was going on in this firm. First of all, there was a history that connected people inside of the firm in a way that was really quite different than most modern Wall Street firms. It was much more typical of older partnerships, where they vacationed together, they traveled together, they had weekend homes next door to each other, they lived on each other's blocks, they belonged to the same country clubs. These guys and gals really were in each other's lives in a very special way. They're not today, interestingly. They're much more like Wall Street today. Much more fragmented in that way, in their relational environment. And we found that there was this, once leadership decided to recover, and leadership is Jimmy Dunn, he basically instructed people, no, we're not letting this go down. There was a moment where he thought about it, and then he consulted with Herman Sandler, the namesake's, what became his widow, Suki, in a very emotional conversation on September 12th, at about 11 o'clock at night, in which they both decided that the firm needed to remain. So from that moment on, Jimmy was committed to making this work. What changed for Jimmy was really interesting. Jimmy was a rough and tumble, a Notre Dame grad, a Long Island Irishman, though born in the United States. Grew up at Bear Stearns, learned all about finance the hard way. And he basically never emoted. He was a screamer. In fact, he was the guy that his two partners relied on to go fire, to go scream, to go fix, to go whatever it took. And he was perfect for the job. The only reason why he survived on September 11th is because he was he was at an amateur PGA event in Westchester because he was an avid golfer. He's only recently gotten back to golf, which is interesting. And what we focused on in the early days was really making it okay to be emotional. My first intense conversation with Jimmy was really about, Jimmy, it's okay to cry. Most likely your two best friends are dead. I didn't say it that way, but that was the reality of the situation. And on Monday, September 17th, he went on, there was this rumor that Sandler O'Neill was going under, and he went on CNBC, whatever that Wall Street 5-minute thing is, where they usually talk about trades and all that stuff. And he went on the air to say, Sandler O'Neill, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect of, no terrorist is going to destroy the American capitalist system. Sandler O'Neill is here to stay. We're not going anywhere. And he started to cry on national TV. And he let himself cry on national TV. And that emotional response allowed the entire organization, gave the entire organization permission to engage in rehabilitating, to engage in therapy, to engage in whatever it took to rebuild the company. So one way to think about this was from September to December, we had 18 therapists deployed to the organization, divided into 3 groups. One group was dealing with the families of those lost, one group was dealing with employees, and one group was dealing with the children, because there were over 78 children under the age of 18 who had lost a parent. So we actually took over the consultation of the mental health and the organization. And we managed it for 5 years. Both of those. So you can see all the hours. I mean, even that trend of 50 hours a month continued out until about late 2003. Think about it, 50 hours a month for an organization to undergo therapy. That's pretty remarkable. And that's just the therapeutic side of the consultation, not the advisory side, not all the work we did with the partnership and the rebuilding of teams and all that other kind of stuff. And just very briefly, they built, and I'm not going to go through this, and I'll send anybody who wants it the presentation, but we basically took a basic concept of psychology and psychoanalysis, which is the therapist must create a safe environment and contain what's ever going on for the patient. We took that idea, and that's that's an old concept of how to deal with trauma. Make it safe. This new idea about the limbic freeze and all of that is something that's a little counter to that, and I'll get into that in a moment. But we taught the organization itself how to contain the trauma and how to rehabilitate itself. We didn't do it for them. And then we moved to replenishment. So it was all of this stuff to get to back to the normalcy in that curve. The piece that I find most interesting about the rebuilding is how to get people to be self-reliant and not dependent. So how to shift people's mindset away from the traumatic experience and how to normalize it. So we did many things to do that. The first thing we did is we grouped people in groups with like experiences. So we ran basically a support group for the 17 who got out of the building for about a year. A little bit less than that, about 8 months, 7-8 months. We ran groups for employees who were on the plaza. We ran groups for the employees who were in Boston who listened to the whole thing on their speakerphone because they were in the middle of a meeting when this all started. We ran groups for people who were joined by their experience of the event. We ran lots of groups for families as well, in addition to this. And then over time, we brought those groups together so they could normalize their experience. What this did is if I was one of the 17 who sort of jumped into the elevator and ran because of my reaction, my flight reaction to this, it's no longer me just dealing with my guilt. It's 17 of us, and we can actually change that guilt into survival thinking, and we can process that differently collectively because now I don't have to be solely responsible. I'm not the only one who made it out. Oh, and by the way, if I'm one of the 44 who was on the plaza that day, about to go into the building, or coming up out of the subway, then I too can deal with my experience. Or if I was on vacation that day, or away on business that day, I too can process my experience. Eventually, we brought the firm together. And eventually, we taught the partnership and the management how to contain. Very similar to psychologists. And so what we taught the organization to do was, instead of responding at the limbic level, is to immediately start doing some very high-level processing about what happened. And that higher-level processing enabled Sandler to be what they are today, to really sort of excel. So I'd love to hear if any of you have any cases you want to talk about. I'm stimulated by this thought.
I just want to, when you said that Jimmy Dunn was unemotional and a screamer, I was privileged with Steve to go up and meet with him in the class. And, we were a bunch of strangers, and when he recounted that story, he actually broke down a little bit, which was amazing. He's a tough guy, and to show that emotion.
Yeah. I only see him a couple times a year because he says every time he sees me, he starts to cry. Which is true. I ran into it at a restaurant we were both in the same restaurant for lunch about a month ago. I walked, he walked up to me, or I walked up to him, and he starts crying. That's true. Yeah. He's become an emotional guy.
Go ahead.
I have a question. Do you think, in the case of your clients, you're actually getting them to be more aware of limbic responses generally in decision-making, so that they defer to cerebral responses?
Yes.
As you condition them to something.
Actually, the case we're going to go over in class tonight is such a company that I've been working with the CEO for a little over 12 years, and that we've built an organization that functions in the way that our brain actually functions. That really drives the organization not to have knee-jerk reactions, but instead to have a much higher level processing, both of the emotional content and of the data.
Question. So, one of the executives, I guess, is like, I was like frozen because of the limbic response. What do you do with that?
I think you need to confront, right? I think you need to really sort of help the executive understand that there's a lot more going on in his organization or her organization, and that it's not, you have to really bring other people into this problem, and you have to examine the problem from multiple points of view. That his organization or her organization's a system, and without really understanding that. So I had a very recent situation in which a CEO who I've been working with in her now second business called me up and said, "Mark, I don't know what to do. Here's the situation. I have a conflict with the board. It's a pretty serious conflict. And frankly, unless the board relinquishes on this issue, I don't think I can stay here." So my first thought was, sort of an irrational knee-jerk reaction. So I begged her to pull some people together and really think about it a little bit deeper. Now the issue was that they needed to, she wanted to change the board structure so they could invest more in the company. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant. So she went away and she came back a week or so later and said, "So here's the real issue laid out." And I brought my head of marketing, my head of sales, and my CFO into this conversation. The issue is that we need to invest over here. The board isn't freeing up the funds, even though we have them. And in addition, we need to give some incentive to the organization through stock options or whatever. But in order to do that, we have to change the cap table, and somebody on the board has to give up something. And literally 2 weeks ago, it became a confrontation with the original founder who still controlled the board and her. And she basically said, in what you might think otherwise was a sort of limbic response, either you do this or else I'm gone, because there's no way I can manage this company. And the board said no. She resigned. A week later, her CFO and CTO resigned. And a week after that, her CMO and her head chief revenue officer resigned. Because it was, once she went back and did the analysis, it moved from being this sort of knee-jerk reaction to what was being done to her by the board, and instead a very serious financial issue that the organization needed to face as a whole. And the board had that limbic response instead of being thoughtful about it.
So was everybody a loser at the end?
Well, I think the executives who left are probably winners, because they all had exit, contracts. And I think the company will probably go away. Now, on the opposite side of that is somebody who Steve knows a little bit about, is a CEO who I was working with for 4.5 years. And he was really a very, very interesting guy. He was an Israeli fighter pilot, saw action in Lebanon, was part of special forces in Israel, left Israel and went to INSEAD and got his MBA because he was interested in management. Was an accomplished serial entrepreneur, had 4 major successes that he sold, so is still somewhat independently wealthy. Was convinced by some venture capitalists to come in and take over a company that had really amazing potential 4.5 years ago, and they deal in digital advertising networks. And he reached a point about 1.5 years ago where he either had to sell the company or make some other remarkable discovery in order to allow the organization to have enough cash flow to survive, because things didn't turn out the way they thought they would. And it has a lot to do, it's a very, very long story that had nothing to do with him. It had to do with these two original founders who refused to leave, and in order to get rid of them, they had to finally buy them out, but it was really traumatic to the organization what these two founders had done. But that's a different story. So what he decided to do is he convinced his CFO, his chief marketing officer, and himself to quit without anything, without any severance or anything, because they could all find jobs tomorrow. And they were the 3 highest paid employees in the company, which would then give the company back cash flow. So then he had a problem of who's going to manage this. So he went and convinced the existing head of sales and the existing head of technology to partner as co-CEOs. Steve actually met with them. It was a while ago, wasn't it? This summer, yeah. And sure enough, that company still exists today. All 47 employees are still employed. There is some real hope now that they've sort of moved to the other side of this financial crisis. And this former CEO is having a great time, actually having dinner with him next week. The former CMO is gainfully employed somewhere else. The former CFO actually had a job the moment he left. So it was, this is really thinking at a very high level about alternatives for an organization rather than shutting it down. He also had to convince the board of major changes. He had to convince the board, instead of taking back ownership of all the stock that these 3 owned, to instead give it back to the entire organization, so the 47 employees had incentive to stay. I mean, he really figured this out along with the CFO and really sort of moved to that other side. Hope that answers your question. I know you had a question.
Actually, what your presentation is very, I can relate to every point on this, because I work for Merck. So we're definitely in a frozen period right now.
Yeah, you really are.
It's a very strange point. I don't know if anybody the word, but like pretty much back in, I think May, we hired a new head of research, and he made an announcement it's going to be a major surgery, it's going to be painful, but we're going to come out of it alive. So, right now, my department was, so October 1st was actually when it happened, when they announced we're cutting at least 20% of the employees. And so my department was one of the first ones to learn global project management. So within a week, they pretty much made the announcement. Everybody was called into the office and said, you're either placed in your position or you don't have a job. So this Friday, actually, 1/3 of our, my colleagues were let go. Very strange environment, but the company is under complete stress. There's no support for any of this. Management is quitting left and right. Even if you're placed, a lot of people are quitting, going to other companies. And it's just, I'm kind of like right in between of this. And, my management kind of said, just wait till, we don't expect you to do any major things, but, just let's deal with this so that we kind of know who stays with the company, who doesn't. So by the end of this month, we should know at least who's staying, who's going, which is going to make it, at least a little bit more comfortable. We're kind of in a privileged place. At least we know we have a job, whereas everybody on our teams that we work with, they're still in this limbo. So, it's kind of just a strange time where nothing is really getting done. Again, Roger is like approving every single part. He's controlling every single decision.
You're frozen.
Yeah, we're frozen.
You're frozen in
We're
that,
frozen.
in that what we call freeze response.
But it's not the first time that Merck has gone through this.
Speak up.
This is not the first time that Merck has gone through this.
Yeah, but I think this is different. For a lot of people, it just hasn't been at this level.
It was a huge merger before that it went on.
Well, I was part of the merger, but this is still.
And prior to that, there was another one. So,
This actually has been going on since about 2000. This is the repeated response cycle. This is Anderson in all its glory, unfortunately.
How much do you think with Merck, it's a residue from the good old days when Vagelos was in charge, and there's a father figure who could do no wrong?
I knew Mr. Vagelos. I did a lot of, we consulted to Merck for 10 years in the 90s. I think a lot of it has to do with it. They've not been able to rebuild leadership post that. And they've had some real missteps in terms of re-energizing their research, which is the heart of any pharmaceutical, right? And so that's been a huge, huge issue.
Well, my expectation of Merck would be that they would be able to operate at a higher level and do something, you know, so we want to do something which is rational, sort of like the last example that you gave, and also communicable in the sense of giving people faith that it's not frozen, but we're doing it and we've thought about how to do it.
Except
That's what I hear here. Everybody's.
yeah, although the way it's different is that there's not an integration of the emotional and the rational. For it to really work in higher functioning, there has to be an integration of emotional and rational. And here, it's only dealing on the rational side. Let's lop off, you know, a third of the folks.
So that may not be rational. I mean, it's certainly not rational. You can't explain it.
Meaning, to them, it's rational, right? We have too many people. Let's get rid of it. You know, this to me drums up a whole another way of sort of thinking about this, which is exactly, I think, on target to the Olympic. The difference about the CEO I just talked about at this digital advertising company is that as soon as they came up with a plan, they started talking to the entire workforce about the plan. And they started processing the emotional content about the plan. And they allowed anybody to leave who wanted to leave. And they really worked this. I mean, this is just like a piece of work we did in the 90s alongside the Merck work we were doing, and Time Warner, where Time Warner was working with Anderson Consulting before it became Accenture on revamping manufacturing. And in that process, they discovered, supposedly, that they didn't need the 7,500 employees that they had. They only needed about 1,500, maybe less. But nobody was talking about it. So what was happening was that, and there were all these batch management functions, and a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on in manufacturing, but there were increase in drug and alcohol abuse. There were junior employees throwing female supervisors against the wall and threatening them. There were male employees tracking female employees out to the parking lot. I mean, there was all sorts of craziness going on in the system. Just like actually in a couple of recorded incidents with Merck.
Actually, funny statement, somebody working on a very high-profile team, they said somebody was off the team before the summer ended, and then they saw the group again, you know, over at the end of the summer, it was 3 or 4 months, they said, everybody has gained so much weight.
Well, there you go.
So I can't believe what happened, but it just made that statement, how everybody just, because of the stress level. You know.
Actually, a team, when I was at AT&T, there was a team of psychologists from here, and I can't remember what department they were in, who were at AT&T doing a mentoring experiment, of which I was a unwitting part of. But those same psychologists did an examination of Shearing Plow in the late 80s, early 90s, when they were reinvestigated by the FDA. And it was remarkable, in the 2 years before the company was sold, there was just an exponential increase of extramarital affairs, drug and alcohol abuse, all the way up to the CEO. Theft. I mean, it was crazy. And they were in the middle of the whole FDA investigation. So to me, there's an absolute fear, flight, freeze, that response is so immediate in us. Because we're only human. So I would agree that it's probably going off. Yes?
Do you ever get called in to work with the federal government?
No.
Who would you like to?
No. I have a colleague who was. I have a colleague who ran a weekend retreat for the Senate in the early 1990s, which was an abysmal failure.